Hello, and welcome to Politics and Prose bookstore. My name is Sarah, and I'm a bookseller at Politics and Prose, where we host a range of in-store events along with classes and trips. Before we get started today, I'd like to ask you to please silence your cell phone so as not to disrupt the event. And when we get to the Q&A portion, please line up at the microphone next to the poll to ask your questions. Today, I'm very excited to welcome Yepoka Yeebo, celebrating the release of Anansi's Gold, the man who looted the West, outfoxed Washington, and swindled the world. Yepoka Yeebo's work has appeared in The Guardian, Huffington Post, The Atlantic, Boomerang, Business Week, and Quartz, among other publications. A graduate of Queen Mary, University of London, and of Columbia University School of Journalism, she divides her time between Accra, London, and New York. Anansi's Gold is her first book. Yeebo will be in conversation with Marcia, Chatelain, the Penn Presidential Compact Professor of Africana Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. Her most recent book, Franchise, The Golden Arches in Black America, won the 2021 Pulitzer Prize. So please join me in welcoming our guests.
Hello, everyone. Well, thank you for joining us. Hi, how are you?
I'm well, thank you. I'm so excited to be here.
I'm so excited to talk about this incredible book. For the folks who have not read it yet, it's available on paperback. Oh, I have a different one, so I won't show this one. Anansi's Gold, The Man Who Swindled the World. Congratulations on the hardcover and the paperback. And most importantly, thank you for writing an incredibly sweeping look at a period of time that I don't think we realize how much we're still living in. And that is a period after the independence of Ghana and the kind of reshaping, I think, of US global politics. And so why don't we start with the basics? What is this book about?
It's about a man named John Ackah Blay-Miezah, and he claimed that he was the heir to a secret fortune hidden away by Kwame Nkrumah, Ghana's first president. And his job was to return this massive fortune of cash, gold, diamonds back to the people of Ghana. But to do that, he needed to pay for lawyers and bankers and that kind of thing. And so he needed cash for that. And so it was a great, great fortune, so great that the majority of it could be returned to the people of Ghana, but he had enough to offer you 10 to 1 on your investment if you just help him out with this. And along with these massive returns, people had the opportunity to build ports and railroads and monorails and massive infrastructure projects in Ghana as well. That was the heart of the story.
So we see all the red flags. We see someone who's offering something that's too good to be true. We have this period of time before the internet where the kind of scams that people are warned about, right? These investment scams are unfolding in the backdrop of US-African relations after the end of colonialism. And so from your perspective, what is it about this period of time that perhaps is so ripe for this kind of manipulation or exploitation?
Kwame Nkrumah wrote about this quite a bit. Ghana at independence was kind of empty. So much had been raised in colonial wars, and there had been so much sort of devastation that there was just so much to build. There was so much to make, and so Ghana was flooded with scammers and con men and people hoping to make a buck. And people did make great, great fortunes in that time. I think also there was just this optimism and hope that was easy to manipulate. It was one of the first nations to gain independence. President Nkrumah himself was a really, really magnetic figure. And people sort of flocked to Ghana not to scam as well. They hoped to help build a nation that would change the world. It was the first self-governed Black nation that meant a great deal to people from all over. Yeah.
When you look at the history of the civil rights movement in the United States, there's certain places that really kind of capture the political imagination of young activists, and Ghana is one of them because of Nkrumah's engagement with Martin Luther King Jr. and the members of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. But I think so few people realize the extent to which these first leaders of African nations are coming to the US. They're coming here to Washington, D.C. They're challenging segregation in many ways in D.C., but they're also being educated at US institutions. And so Lincoln University in Pennsylvania, as well as the University of Pennsylvania, is playing a role in this story. How did US higher education and US institutions kind of fuel the start of this new independent Africa?
So countless people who would become prominent leaders in Africa studied in this country. But like you said, it was also this period of segregation and great social upheaval. And so they witnessed this firsthand. And there was this sort of weird duality to what they were experiencing, because a lot of them found that when it was made clear that they were African rather than African American, they were treated differently. There was a really famous orange juice incident where a Ghanaian politician was declined service at a rest stop, and this triggered an international incident. And it was only an incident because he was an African politician. It was just a weird position to be in. But these people who came as students also left with these ideas about freedom, these very grand, very American ideas about freedom, but also this knowledge that there were very clear limits to who was actually granted this freedom. And it would fuel a lot of independence movements, because a lot of people realized that they weren't just seeking freedom for themselves or their people. It was a global movement. They were seeking freedom for all Black people. And Nkrumah writes about this really movingly as he's leaving the United States, after he's been to Lincoln, after he's been to Penn, and he's on the boat leaving, and I think he leaves from New York, and he sees the Statue of Liberty, and he realizes how much it means to him that freedom is granted to people who look like him, and not just because they're African.
One of the things that I think is particularly poignant about reading this book right now is when the hardcover came out, it was during a time where here in the United States we had a semblance of a functioning government. Now the paperback is coming out in a time in which the implosion of the federal government seems to be the priority of the executive branch. There was a question in, oh yes. The point I was trying to make is that one of the first kind of targets of this administration was the United States international development, right? USAID became the kind of, the first target in many ways. And this is also a book about visions of development. And I think the growth of the development apparatus in the 1960s. And so people are coming to Ghana to try to build. People are trying to come to Ghana to make money. And so how does our main character, our man John, kind of understand the world that is evolving around him? Because this is very much a book about a person's understanding of these dynamics.
So I thought the really interesting thing about this was that Blay-Miezah knew exactly what people wanted to hear. And so His first supporters were mainly sort of Black American businessmen in Philadelphia. He had defrauded the Bellevue Stratford Hotel. I think the charge was defrauding an innkeeper. He claimed that the Ghanaian embassy was going to pay his bills. They did not. He was hemmed up and sent to Greaterford Prison. And there he met a priest who was also an activist. And this priest would sort of get him out of jail and connect him with a man named Robert Ellis, who was his main partner, and to a whole bunch of other people. And to these people, Blay-Miezah sold like a vision of economic liberation. They'd not just be investing in like getting this money back to Ghana and getting their like 10 times returns, 100 times returns. They'd also be able to like build connections between Philly and Ghana. They would provide liberation not just for like Ghanaians, but for Black Philadelphians as well. And so this was like a community. I remember speaking to the children of one of these investors, and you remember they had like T-shirts and parties, and they hung out together, and it felt like they were doing something really grand and transformative. And it wasn't just that they'd get rich, they'd reclaim part of their heritage and like give everybody enough wealth to survive and to thrive. To other investors, and these were sort of wealthy white like businessmen, like lots of lawyers, dentists, business owners, people who owned like factories in like Pennsylvania and New Jersey. He was selling the chance to build something absolutely grand, and this was at a time where Philadelphia was particularly sort of beset by collapse. And so they'd seen this grand city come to ruin, and they'd seen their ability to do things in this grand city come to sort of an end. And now there was this like completely empty stretch of land they could do absolutely anything in, and they could make an absolute fortune in. And that was incredibly attractive to an insane number of people. I think eventually when there was a court case, they found 300 investors in like the Philadelphia area alone.
And when we talk about this kind of investment, one of the things that you write in the book is that for some of the people who gave money to this scheme, they didn't know Ghana at all, and it didn't matter, right? And so when we think about how much of this, the scam was predicated on preconceived notions of Africa. What is an African state? What is African leadership? What is African capacity for self-governance? How does the role of stereotype or ignorance kind of allow John to do this scam?
So the obvious first thing was that they had to believe that Kwame Nkrumah would steal just like billions upon billions in resources and stock them away, and nobody would notice or really fully understand what was going on. And then they also had to believe that they were kind of getting one over on Blay-Miezah, and he didn't really understand what it was that he was offering people. Because otherwise, why would he be handing out free money? And so, yeah, people would like go on these trips to Ghana that were very, very carefully arranged. So they would they go on drives to like see like the land they were buying, and like the roads they would take were just like lined with billboards for this entirely false organization. And they would sort of meet people that seemed prominent but not understand who they were. But if they were Black, they'd like assume they were government ministers. Usually they were just other investors. That it relied on a great deal of willful ignorance. and the idea that Ghanaians didn't fully understand their own wealth or really own it, because like why would you think that you could have a piece of something that didn't belong to you and essentially for free? Yeah, it took a lot of actually a lot of reliance on ignorance, but also the idea that Ghanaians didn't really know or deserve their own wealth. Yeah.
And so much of what you're talking about is as this idea that there's this hidden gold that people can just find a way to get a piece of. There's the actual on the ground lived experience of people in Ghana who are distressed, who are suffering as a result of political instability and the coups, right? And so, to the extent that you could kind of know what's happening in this world and inhabit kind of your own realities, how exposed was this scam in Ghana versus among this investor class in both, not just US, the UK, and eventually Korea?
Oh, I spoke to someone who grew up around this time, and she was like, "Oh, everybody knew what he was up to." Like, if you were there at the time and you'd seen like the Nkrumah administration and you'd seen what happened after with the coups, like you probably knew to a certain extent that there wasn't like a massive fortune stocked away, that Nkrumah was known for like living a very simple, like almost frugal life, and was very unlikely to have stolen anything. And that aside, Blay-Miezah sort of surrounded himself with people who had known Nkrumah, people who had been like politicians or like legislators at the time, and sort of used them to bolster his claims that he was like the heir to this fortune, that he knew all the ins and outs of this. But they were almost exclusively people who had been thrown in jail for corruption by Nkrumah. And they were also people who were quite clearly aware of what was going on. They were the people who'd made up the lies about what it was that had happened about Nkrumah being a thief and a massively like profligate spender, who had like gold taps and four Thunderbirds and that kind of thing. And so they were well aware that they were lying out behind this lie and behind a scam. And essentially, they kind of just were trying to get what they could out of it, especially when things were difficult for them and Ghana was going through a lot of instability. Yeah, when I talk to people about why it was that they would line up behind Nkrumah, you have to understand that like people were poor, people were struggling, and they just kind of like grabbed onto what they could. Yeah.
And so eventually this scam kind of reaches into the recesses of the Nixon administration. And it's almost a full decade before this actually collapses. How does investing in hidden gold become a legitimate investment opportunity for people who are at the highest levels of government?
So this was John Mitchell, who of course was part of the Nixon administration, and I think was the only person actually like prosecuted for his involvement in the Watergate scandal. In the 1980s, he became an advisor to Blay-Miezah, and ostensibly he was there to like help figure out like the legal tangle around getting hold of this money. What he mostly actually did, was call investors who were threatening to drop out and sort of use his reputation to like convince them to stay and convince them to keep their money in. And for this he was said to be getting like, I think it was like towards the end, 700 million for his investment, which is obviously just like a ridiculous sum, especially for like the 1980s. I just think it's kind of what you said. Like people didn't fully understand how Ghana or gold worked. There was at one point like a scheme Blay-Miezah was running to like smuggle gold out of Ghana, and this kind of relied on packing gold bars into an aeroplane, but that only worked if you didn't know how much a gold bar weighs. Yeah, and so getting like hundreds of them onto a plane was just not going to work. There was another scheme to like Blay-Miezah managed a football team like quite well. He's still quite famous for it. And there was a scheme to walk the players across the border with like gold tucked into their like Ghanaian traditional wear and smuggle gold out of Ghana that way. Again, it wouldn't work because gold is heavy. So I think people just didn't understand how things worked. And again, we're relying on a bunch of stereotypes to make decisions about this.
And in terms of thinking about the arc of this, right? So, you know, if a conspiracy involves more than one person, it will ultimately collapse, right? You can't have this many people holding on to a secret or perpetrating a lie this long. What eventually kind of unravels this type of scheming?
So when the investors were originally like convinced to join, they were told they'd get their money back in like weeks, sometimes months at the most, and then a month would go by and they'd be told, well, there's been some complication at the bank, or something happened in Ghanaian politics that held things up, or there'd just always be an excuse. And Blay-Miezah was really good at using like events in like politics or in the world to like provide excuses for this. And then that would happen on kind of a grand scale. So everybody would be told to arrive in Switzerland or in a Caribbean island, like ready to get their money. So people would like open up bank accounts and all arrive at a lavish hotel, and then they spend weeks there waiting for this to finish up. And towards the end of this, like Ghana's government was actually kind of involved in this. So the finance minister would be sitting in a room drawing up a ledger of the people who had invested and the money they would be getting back. And then everybody would get ready to like get their like giant sum of money, and Blay-Miezah would just disappear. And this happened like over and over and over and over, to the point that like investors were running out of money. They were bankrolling Blay-Miezah. They were paying for these hotels for his incredibly lavish lifestyle, and like towards the end, they were just like running out their credit cards. But I think what really did it was the 60 Minutes appearance. There was a 60 Minutes segment about him. And you see Blay-Miezah like in this very lavish London mansion on like a reproduction Louis XV chair that like Ed Bradley described as a throne, telling this story that he is the heir to a secret fortune. Investors are helping him like wrest it from the banks, and it all just there's a bit of the 60 Minutes bit where he's telling this story. Blay-Miezah is telling this story about how he was at Nkrumah's bedside when he died in Romania in 1972, and this is when he was entrusted with the secret. And then Ed Bradley pans to Greaterford Prison, which is actually where Blay-Miezah was when Nkrumah died in 1972. And it made everybody involved, especially the Ghanaian government, look incredibly stupid. So after that aired, Blay-Miezah was like called back to Ghana and put on house arrest, and it coincided with Ghana transitioning into a democracy, and also rehabilitating Kwame Nkrumah's reputation and doing that kind of nation building. And so Blay-Miezah became kind of a liability, and that's kind of what shut it all down. It sort of like chundered on very quietly until the American federal government actually came up with like a case. And I think he was indicted by a grand jury, and so there were plans to extradite him, and so the Americans send word to Ghana that it's like time to give him up, and get word back that he had died. He'd actually been dead for a while. So he ultimately kind of got away with it.
Well, this is really fascinating because you can still see that interview on YouTube. It's really, really good work. I mean, it's classic Ed Bradley on 60 Minutes. But one of the things I'm curious about is how you, as a journalist, are thinking about this story from the perspective of the people who are reporting on this but are not kind of asking big questions until later, and then telling a story of kind of people who are caught in this matrix. So when you made the decision to write this book in this way, how did your journalism background work for it, and how, as a Ghanaian Brit also interacting with this work, how did that unfold in order to tell the story that you wanted to tell?
I kind of didn't set out to write it the way I eventually wrote it. I set out to write like a caper. I thought it would be fun. At the time, from what I knew, he was kind of like a Robin Hood character. He mostly like stole from the rich and gave to himself mostly. He was very generous with people and is very remembered for that, but mostly gave to himself. And like when I was like hanging out at the county like clerk's office in Philadelphia, just like photocopying court papers, and talking to people about what I was researching, everybody thought it was hilarious, like that he got one over on these like prominent Philadelphia families. Then I realized that a lot of it was difficult to understand unless I had the historical context of like who Nkrumah was, whether it was possible that he had actually stolen money. It wasn't, but I had to look into it. And that required like writing about the history of this. And so initially I was mostly going through like old papers and old accounts of what happened, which was deeply, deeply entertaining. And especially just because like in the Philly papers really early, he's like Blay-Miezah is written up as this like legitimate businessman who's like importing African hardwoods that would blunt the teeth of American termites. And then the next time it's in the papers, it's for attempting to defraud Gerard Bank. And then in the Guardian papers, there was like an editor who was like in his pocket, so who would write all this like really, really loving coverage of what he was up to, and then after stuff blew up, had to kind of walk back everything. And so I feel like I just realized obviously that like newspaper coverage is always very skewed by like who's writing it, by why they're writing it, by when they're writing it, by how much information they have access to, which is why I ended up having to do so much like research that looked at primary sources, and also why I had to like rely on lots of like personal accounts and interviews with people. And so I spent a lot of time talking to people who like had known Blay-Miezah, had worked with him, and people have like fantastic personal archives of stuff. Of like people write memoirs that never get published. They have pictures, they have videos, they have documents, and it was just like I felt honored to get access to all these things and to like build them into my timeline of what was going on and get a sense of how people experience what was going on.
What was it like interviewing his family members?
Oh, that was a lot of fun. They were very guarded because obviously they had quite a time. Like,
Well, what happened to his money?
yeah, that's the big question.
Is that the second book?
Yeah, there's no sign of where it went. Like after he died, there was like the standard like probate situation, but that was nobody could actually find the money that he had gotten from all these investors. And there are loads of rumors about who might have stolen it or where it might have gone.
Because I think you said it was like $15 million.
That was just in Philly. I think when the big case happened, it was like $300 million they thought that he had gotten. Yeah, and there's just no trace of it
Should we
anywhere.
all go try to find it?
I think we should. It's somewhere. And like after he died, there were all these stories about how he'd been like cryogenically frozen. So when the time came to release the money, like he would be revived and it would all come to an end. And there were like conflicting stories about where he died and how he died.
Yeah.
It was all a bit like chaotic. And there are definitely people who think he like faked his death and is still alive and sort of ran off with all this money.
That's intriguing. So I have a few more questions and then we'll open it up for the audience. Can we talk a little bit about your process for research? We were talking earlier about just how exquisitely researched this book is. I mean, it is deeply, deeply sourced and footnoted and cited. And I know you had to spend a lot of time, on 3 continents, essentially, maybe even 4, to get to this work. Can you tell us a little bit about your research process?
It was really chaotic. I'd find like a batch of information. I think the first thing I found were a bunch of State Department cables between Shirley Temple Black, like Shirley Temple, the child star. She was ambassador for Ghana for a while, and Henry Kissinger. And that's when I realized that like there was a great deal going on here. And then, so I'd find batches of information like that, and then I'd have to like make a timeline with them just to get a sense of like what happened when. And then there were lots and lots of trips to Ghana to talk to people, and lots of trips here. And I think I got to the point where it was just like inundated with information, and I had to like make a timeline and spreadsheets and a list of characters and get a sense of what happened. And also because it's a scam. So there are just a lot of lies, and you have to get a sense of like what actually happened. What are the stories people were telling about what was happening, and how much of this is reliable and how much isn't. And so then I would have to do like the deeper research. So like the newspapers, the other secondary sources. And then it just got to the really deep point where I was trying to find specific details for every point on like my timeline. So like, what was the weather that day? What were the China patterns? There was this other vein of research, which was like urban legends people would tell me that would end up being true. And so somebody told me that like in the 70s in Philly, there were stories about this African prince who was like wandering, like going around town, meeting with all these prominent families. Like he'd like step out of the limo, dressed in his finery, and everybody would watch. And that ended up being true. That ended up being like what Blay-Miezah was up to in 1972 when he ended up defrauding the Bellevue Stratford Hotel. Yeah, there were a bunch of these things where I like just heard stories and had to stand them up. There was another one about how Blay-Miezah smuggled things through customs by first tricking them into destroying a historical artifact. Yeah, it's weird. He like had someone, allegedly, this is a story that I could never stand up, but he had someone stoke a stool in weed bitters, which is just like alcohol infused with marijuana. And then he was stopped at customs at Heathrow, and they like inspected the stool. They couldn't figure out what it was, and so they smashed it. And then he said it was like a giant, like massively important historical artifact, and they had to pay him compensation. And then subsequently, whenever he was bringing stuff to Heathrow, they didn't stop him, even if it was flagged by the dogs or whatever. And I could never find proof that that actually happened.
That's a good story.
I know. I tried.
You know, it strikes me as a kind of running theme in this story is there's a great deal of vulnerability because people want something that can elicit a lot of shame, whether it's a big payday, whether it's to make tons of money. But in a lot of this is about something that you said at the beginning of this conversation. People want to be part of something meaningful. And when you look at the relationship between African Americans and the decolonizing African nations, there's such a deep desire for connection. There's such a deep desire for, to become patriated back home. But you realize back home isn't what you thought it was. And so when you're writing this book, what kind of insights do you think this particular story had on that relationship between kind of Black America and the continent at this and the African continent at this moment, in the ways that people talked about the African king who lived in Philadelphia, or these dreams of having an ownership stake in Ghana? Because as you talk about the story, this is part of the manipulation as well, of wanting to have a place.
Yeah. Wanting to have a place was definitely something he sold, but also not just wanting to have a place, like wanting to have like a huge chunk of this nation. Like they were just promised like you belong here and you have a home here. They were also promised like you will own a huge chunk of land, or you will own the port, or you will own like the monorail. He was great at manipulating that longing for like a home and for connection and for a sense of like history. But he also really played on kind of the greed.
Yeah.
That was a huge aspect. And like he was wonderful at offering people just like, you will make a great deal of money, offering like whatever it was their greed needed, but also promising that like along with making all this money, you will help build a nation, you will help save people, you will provide homes and schools and water and electricity, you will kind of be a savior. Yeah, you'll be a saint, you'll be like someone they build statues to. Yeah.
I have two more questions, and then we'll open it up for the audience. The first one is, how do you think that the frameworks that you write about in your book, how do you think that they present themselves today in looking at, whether it's the types of scams that come through email or WhatsApp, or your phone or Telegram, or crypto, whatever it is? And then I'm curious, we look at this period of time of people as being naive and not having the internet, and so they fall for things. But today people fall for things just as much.
Yeah. The scam is basically still running. There are actually a few people still running this exact same scam, like with the stories about Nkrumah, with Blay-Miezah as like the heart of it. There are still people actively investing in it. They were like at one point like preying on like former investors as well, like going back to them for money over and over again. And the basic scam, like the inheritance scam, it's like it hasn't stopped. Like it predates all of this, and it keeps happening. Like somebody would be like, I inherited all this cash and I need help getting it from the banks. Yeah, it still happens. It's still in emails and also in personal networks. Like a lot of people who got caught up in this scam were people who trusted their like friends or neighbors or family. And that's how the scam works as well. Like somebody you actually trust or respect will tell you about something that's too good to be true and a can't miss investment. And that is how they will get you. I also think that just the general idea that you will get something for nothing is still incredibly attractive, especially when the economy is a bit crap, especially when people are anxious. It's very easy to manipulate people. I've noticed, like in Britain and I think here as well, the number of scams people encounter daily is just multiplied ridiculously. Like texts, phone calls, like people are actively scamming in very similar ways. And I think preying on people's like ignorance, insecurity, greed, that kind of thing, it's never going to stop. It's never going to die. It's as old as humanity.
Wow. Okay, last question. I always like to ask writers, how has this book changed you as a person?
I find that hard to answer just because it changed so much about everything I do. It changed the way I looked at research because, as I said, I thought I was writing like a fun caper, and then I ended up doing like all this really deep historical research. I also didn't realize how little there was about Ghana, like written about Ghana. Like I'd go to find like a quick biography of a Ghanaian leader, and I just wouldn't find one, or I'd find one from 1972 and nothing since. And then I'd have to like research all that stuff from scratch. I also didn't realize how much stuff is actively like disappeared. Like I'd go to like order a book and they'd be like at the British Library where they're very careful about what you do, and there'd be like pages ripped out. There was a report about all the atrocities that happened in Ghana in the 1980s that Blay-Miezah was kind of sort of intertwined with. And this had been like completely scrubbed from the internet. It was impossible. Like it took days and days and days to find a copy of it. Yeah, and I didn't realize how hard people work to erase history, how hard people work to manipulate history, how hard people work to obscure things and I guess twist it to their own ends, and how hard it is to undo that and try to determine what actually happened. Yeah.
That's really powerful. Well, folks, can you please join me in applauding the release of the paperback of Anzani's Gold, The Man Who Swindled the World. And now we'll open it up for questions from the audience. If you're able, please use the microphone here so that the recording can pick up your question. As we prepare questions, has Hollywood come calling? This is going to be an incredible Netflix streaming series. Are you allowed to say that?
I hope there will be something in the near future.
I think this would be incredible to watch on television. Any questions? Yes.
So let me just get this straight, what we're talking about, just to clarify it for me. The gentleman who did most of this scamming, his name is there one person and his name is?
John Ackah Blay-Miezah.
Okay. Now, did he have any relationship to Nkrumah?
He didn't actually. I found like one account like during a court case of a possible meeting, but I could never like find any other indications that they'd ever met. But Blay-Miezah like was really good at making it seem like they were related. They came from the same part of Ghana, and there's like a chance they cross paths at like a public meeting. Like Kwame Nkrumah like met a lot of people, shook a lot of hands, that kind of thing. But yeah, he definitely wasn't what he said. Like he said it was his nephew or his confidant. Like none of that was true.
How much did he make overall on this?
We don't actually know, obviously, because people don't like to talk about being taken advantage of or being scammed. But when he was indicted, I think the sum was 300 million in the United States alone. And the scam was active here, but also like in the UK, in Ghana, in Germany, as far as Japan. So I don't think it's possible to determine how much like he made. There were no like official records or anything.
Was this just after the independence, after Ghana received independence?
The scam ran from about 1972 when President Nkrumah died until, I guess, Blay-Miezah's death, which was about 1992. So yeah.
Was Nkrumah aware of any of this?
He was dead before it began, but obviously after the coup, when people started telling all these stories about him, he was aware of the lies about him. Yeah.
And one other thing, what can you tell me about Nkrumah? In other words, how did he rise up? What was his development as a leader and so forth? How did he get so involved?
He was, like, as you mentioned, involved in like a lot of international like student groups. So like when he went to Lincoln University, when he was at Penn briefly, he was like an organizer. Also, when he like lived in the UK, and then he went back to Ghana and sort of got into politics. So he ran to be an MP. And it was like this weird period where Ghana was fighting for independence, so he was like jailed, and there was a great deal of like chaos and violence, and out of that, like the independence movement rose.
And he was trying to protect the wealth of Ghana for the people, for their own development. What happened? What went on there? In other words, it was already a lot of wealth developed.
There wasn't actually all the wealth that Ghana had that had been extracted immediately went abroad. It was like a British colony, so everything like was geared towards removing the wealth. Like there were railroads, but they were from like the mine to the port. There were roads, but again, they just ran from the interior directly to the port. And so there wasn't actually much wealth that belonged to Ghana that had stayed in Ghana. It had enriched not just the British, but like Dutch, the Portuguese. Yeah.
So there wasn't a big storage of gold or.
No, actually, there's this ridiculous situation where obviously after the Second World War, Britain needed to shore up the pound, and so during this period, it like removed like money during the like independence fight period. It removed money and said that this would go back to Ghana at independence, but in the meantime, it was removed and invested in London. And then the like agency responsible for investing it somehow lost like tens of millions in the space of a few years. And so all this money Ghana was promised at independence had kind of just disappeared. Nkrumah actually had to go looking for it. He sent someone to London to find out what had happened. And it had just been invested so horribly that there was very little of it left.
Did Nkrumah die with much money?
Very little, actually. He died in a hospital in Romania. It was just like his bodyguard and his nephew. I think all he had in his will were like the royalties for the books he had written. There wasn't much else there, like no properties, no gold tabs, no scads of no like heaps of gold bars. Yeah, he lived very, very modestly, and he died that way too. Thank you.
So thank you very much for this beautiful dialogue. My late father went to Lincoln University, and he was very interested in helping the economic development of Africa, of Nigeria in particular, but not through fraudulent means. He wanted to help with industry. So it was very interesting to hear, you both movingly evoke the importance of that. But my question is more broad, and following up on what these gentlemen's questions. What were the interesting parts of history that you felt were erased or that should be explored more deeply? Is that a question? Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for your question. Honestly, all of it. I know that feels like a throwaway answer, but like truly the hardest part of writing this book was just pinning down what actually happened versus what people said happened. And there'd be like loads of times where there'd just be contradictory information to wade through. I'm trying to think of an example that isn't incredibly arcane. Ghana is a relatively new nation. Like, independence was 1957. Ghana's history before that, like a great deal of it had been just destroyed. Even at independence, like Britain was burning just piles and piles of records, not just in Ghana, like in every place that was colonized. Things were destroyed or sent back to Britain to be destroyed. Yeah, even afterwards, like I said, it was impossible to find basic historical information. Like pages were disappeared out of books, books were disappeared entirely. Yeah, there was just this ridiculous dearth of information about Ghana that kind of broke my heart, because it just meant that people hadn't had the chance to tell these stories about this brand new country, or like even like conceive of some of these things. And it's not that there isn't fantastic writing and historical research about Ghana by some brilliant, brilliant people. It's just that there's not enough of it. Yeah, there's an entire world out there that hasn't been written about. Like, it's remarkable. Thank you for your question.
Any other questions from the audience?
Yeah. Okay, so what is it like today? In other words, has it cleared up? Is it still have remnants of this kind of manipulation stuff?
Yeah, that's what was probably the most heartbreaking thing about this. The 60 Minutes clip goes around like a lot. It gets rebroadcast on the news. It gets passed around on social media, and it's because people are still asking whether Blay-Miezah's story is true and whether the money still exists. So there was even like in the early noughties, like a bunch of people, including some investors from this, petitioned the government to investigate whether there were any Swiss bank accounts, and they didn't find anything. But that didn't stop people like telling the story. And yeah, there's still plenty of people who think that Ghana is poor because Kwame Nkrumah stole all the money. I mean, there are plenty of people who don't and who have a clearer sense of what it was that happened to Ghana's wealth, which was just that it was all ripped out and taken elsewhere. But yeah, it hasn't cleared up at all, and it's pretty awful, actually. Yeah.
I mean, do they have elections today? Is there a
Ghana itself? Yeah, it's a democracy. Yeah. So there are like it's still politics, it's still contentious, but there are pretty regular elections. There are two main parties. It like flips back and forth. It's even through this period, like a wonderful country that is ridiculously functional, even when the worst things are happening, like through devastation, through economic devastation, through military coups. There's still this beautiful, resilient country underneath, and people who have propped it up regardless of what's going on. Yeah.
And their resources today, are they being used properly?
Yeah. I don't think so. Like, it's still the case that a lot of the resources are controlled, managed, extracted by foreign companies who take a great deal of the wealth away in pretty much the same way as the colonial era. And it's gotten to this point, as like the price of gold keeps going up, so people keep buying gold. So There's like a lot of like wildcat gold mining in Ghana, but as the price of gold has gone up, like the mining has gotten like out of control. People are like digging up the forest and farms, and it's gotten to the point that like it's affecting water supplies. Rivers are being polluted with the like chemicals that are used to like extract gold. So yeah, it's just kind of taken another form.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's what I was wondering.
That's a
whether it's
fantastic
cleared
question,
up,
yeah.
or it's basically the same thing in another form.
Same thing in another form, I think. Yeah.
Well, folks, you have a reading assignment now to read this incredible book. Our author will be available for signing. Thank you again for joining us for the celebration of the paperback release of Anansi's Gold, The Man Who Swindled the World.
Thank you so much.